Hi there and welcome to this week's vlog. In a couple of hours I'll be heading off for my 2-yearly eyesight check with Specsavers. I'm pretty sure that over the last 2 years my eyesight has deteriorated a little bit, so I fully expect that I'll have to buy some new glasses, not at all cheap, but worth having so I can actually see properly. And I want to talk a little bit today about eyesight, about what do we see. Perhaps not so much with our physical eyes, but with our inner eyes, if you like, our spiritual eyes, perhaps we could say. And part of the reason for that, not only that I'm going to Specsavers today, but I was reading earlier in this week in John chapter 12, and I'm sure you know the story of Lazarus in the New Testament, where a friend of Jesus, he dies, Jesus calls him back to life. And it's a wonderful miracle that Lazarus, who died, is alive again. Jesus called him back to life. The shocking thing is really that whereas all the people who knew Lazarus celebrated this wonderful miracle, the religious leaders were told in John chapter 12 verse 10 that they wanted actually to kill Lazarus because he was telling people about Jesus. So whereas this great miracle had taken place, somebody who died was alive again, all the religious leaders could think of was, we need to get rid of Lazarus because he's spreading this news about Jesus. So most people saw this as a great miracle. The religious leaders saw it as something to be got rid of, something distasteful, something that threatened their position perhaps. And as you read the Gospels and the ministry and life of Jesus, you can see how he saw people in a different way. Let's think of some examples. Blind Bartimaeus, for example, sat by the roadside. He was a blind beggar. Nobody paid him any attention. But when Jesus walked by with this great crowd and Bartimaeus cried out, the people tried to shut him up. But Jesus said, call him to me. And Jesus spent time with Bartimaeus. He healed him so that Bartimaeus could see. Jesus saw Bartimaeus as someone precious in God's sight. I think of more than one occasion where Jesus met someone who had this dreaded skin disease, leprosy or whatever it was. And on one occasion, at least one occasion, Jesus reached out and touched the man. That would be unheard of in that day. If you touch him, you're going to get infected yourself. But no, Jesus brought healing to that man. He again showed this man is precious in God's sight. Or we can think of the woman caught in adultery, brought to Jesus. And again, the religious leaders wanting to stone her as the law demanded. But Jesus says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And they all went away. And Jesus says to this woman, neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. So Jesus saw this woman as precious in God's sight. Or the Samaritan woman at the well, Jesus spends time, and that was unheard of, a Jewish man spending time not only with a Samaritan, but a Samaritan woman. And she comes to see that Jesus is the Messiah, and she spread the news with her village, and they too come to faith. Jesus sees this woman as precious in God's sight. So how do we see people? What do our eyes tell us? Not only our physical eyes, but our emotional, our spiritual eyes. Perhaps when you go do some shopping in a supermarket and the checkout person is really grumpy, and you immediately think, what a horrible person that is. Maybe, who knows, maybe it's a lady whose husband beats her when she gets home, or a woman whose husband has just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Who knows the reasons behind that person's grumpiness? Do we see the real person beneath? Walking down the street, we see somebody who is very different from us, and we perhaps are tempted immediately to make conclusions about that person. But how do we know? Do we see the real person, the person who's loved by God, precious in God's sight? It's a great story in the Old Testament of Prophet Samuel is told by God to go to the home of a man called Jesse to anoint one of his sons as the new king. And Jesse sees quite a number of, Samuel sees quite a number of Jesse's sons. They're big and strong, and time after time, Samuel thinks maybe this is the one, but God says no. And in the end, the youngest, a lad called David, is called in from the fields where he's looking after the sheep. And God says to him, this is the man. And then God says to Samuel, human beings judge from the outward appearance, but I see a person's heart. So my challenge really to myself and to us all is, what do we see when we see a person? What do we see when we see a situation? Maybe we're going through a tough time. What do we see? A really horrible situation? Or do we maybe glimpse that maybe God is allowing that for a purpose, to teach us, to help us to grow? What do we see when we meet someone we find it really hard to get on with? Do we see a horrible person we want to keep away from, or someone who God loves and we want to love too? So there's a challenge. As I go off to Specsavers in a little while, what do we see? What do we see with our spiritual eyes? Do we see people as God sees them? Are we compelled by the love of God? Thank you so much for watching this week. God bless you. Have a great week.